Hi, this is Ashish from developerhut.net and welcome to the next session of Into the Spring series, which is how to create a batch application in a Spring. So in this section, we'll be creating very simple batch application using Spring Batch framework. So let's go ahead and we will see what exactly the batch, what is Spring Batch framework, and how we can create a very simple batch application. So now what exactly the batch is? So whenever we want to perform the operation on huge amount of data, in that case, we will require to create such kind of a application, which is a batch application. For example, in a banking system, you want to generate the account statement for each account and then you create the statement and then you send it over to a mail. Now, in this case, it is not only for particular account. However, this account statement is generated for each and every customer. So there will be a thousands of account, right, where we will be reading the data from the database. We will generate the account statement and then we will send it to the registered email ID. So in this case, we will create a batch application. So now what exactly the Spring Batch? So Spring Batch is a open source framework provided by the Spring to create such batch application. This Spring Batch framework will automate all these batch operations. Plus, this also provides lot of functionalities to create batches and work with those batches very efficiently. Now, what exactly this Spring Batch contain? So basically, Spring Batch contains three basic tasks. The first is reading the data from the source. For example, reading the large number of data from the database or from the file or from the queue, right? Once data is read, then we will process that data or we apply the business logic to that data. And third is we will write that data in some other file system or a database or on a queue. So basically these are the three operations which generally we do in a batch programming. Now what exactly the Spring Batch contains, right? So Spring Batch, as I mentioned, it contains item reader, then item processor and item writer. So reader is to read the data from the source, then processor is to apply the business logic and writer is to write that data on particular source or destination, right? Now all these three items enclosed in a step. So each step consists of one item reader, one item processor and one item writer. Now, this step is enclosed in a job. So, one particular job can have the multiple steps. And then we have a job launcher, and this job launcher launches the job, right? And all these are connected with the job repository, where Spring Batch will keep the track of all the jobs and the steps and its status as well. So this is kind of a metadata information which Spring Batch keep in the job repository. So this is basically the Spring Batch stereotypes, right? So first we have a job, right? And then each job contain a step and each step can have one reader, processor and writer. Now, in this our case, we will create a very simple application where we will be reading the data from the file system, then we will process that data and then we will write that data on the console. So let's go ahead and start creating the Spring Batch application. Okay, let's get started with creating a very simple Spring project. So we'll be creating a Maven project, language Java and version will be Spring Boot version will be 3.4.1. Let's create a group ID which is com.developerhut dot into the Spring. Then we will give the name to the project is Spring hyphen batch hyphen service. Okay, let's update the package name. So I will just remove. the Spring Batch service. I don't want bigger package names here. Now packaging will be of jar and Java version is 17. Let's add the dependencies. So majorly we required two dependencies. First is of course we are creating the batch project, so we'll need a Spring Batch from IO package. So Spring Batch. Then another is HSQLDB, which is HyperSQL database. So Spring Batch internally use a database to take care of few things while running the batch applications. So we required some kind of a database. So we will be using the HyperSQL database, which do not require any kind of installation on your disk, on your operating system like MySQL or Postgres. This can be simply embedded into this application and it works as a in-memory database. So we will be using HyperSQL. And that's it. These are the two dependencies we require. Let's generate the project. Okay, so I have imported the project. Now, next is let's look at the data file. So I have created a data.csv file which contains some data. So what we saw in our earlier section, right? So this will be a simple CSV file which contain first name and the last name, and we will be reading this file, extracting this data and putting this data into some writer kind of a format, either in the file or either in on the screen, or maybe we can put it in the database as well. So we have the data file ready. Now let's go ahead and start creating the models for this. So the first thing is that we need to create over here is we will create a very simple model class. So I will simply go here and will say new, I will say class, and I will say user. I will put this in model package or a Pojo package. You can give whatever name that you want. Now let's create variables. So I will say private string first name and private string last name, right? Now let's create the constructors. So I will simply say constructor using fields, right? These are the, so let's create the constructor and getter setter. So I will simply create a getter setter first. I will say select all and I will say generate, and let's also create the constructor. So make sure that for this you create both the constructor, the no argument constructor and parameterized constructor. So both are required. So constructors are ready and getter setters are ready. So our model class is completely ready. Now next is we will be simply creating the processor, right? So basically in a batch case, in a Spring Batch will automatically provides a reader file. So in our case, we are using a flat file, which is a CSV file. So it provides a flat file item reader class, which will help us to read the data from the file. The next thing that we need to create is the processor class, which will be processing on that data. And the next is the writer class, which are also available in a Spring Batch, but we will create our own for understanding purpose. So now let's go ahead and create a very simple processor class. So I will simply go here and I will say new, I will say class, I will say user item processor, and I will put this in processor package. Let's click on finish and we have a processor class. Now in processor class, you simply need to implement item processor, okay, so that we can use that methods. So I will say implements item processor, right? So item processor, and we also need to provide what will be the input and what will be the output. So input is the user class, right? And output will also be again a user object. Okay. So in this both the case, we will be providing object, user object as the input and user object as the output. However, the output will be little bit a modified version of the input. Okay, we will see that now. So let's override the method. So if you go and implement a method which is a process method, right, which will take user as input and also provide user as output. Okay, so what are we going to do in this processor is we will be applying our business logic. Okay, so whatever the data that you are getting, you will process that object, convert that object into some other format, and then you are providing that object to the writer. Okay, so this is what we are going to do. So in our case, what we will be doing here is we will be simply updating the user first name and last name with uppercase value, right? So what we will do is I will simply say user dot get first name, right, dot to uppercase, right? So this is the uppercase object. Let's store this in a variable. I will simply say first name, right, and then user dot get last name dot to uppercase, right, and let's also store this in the last name variable, and then we'll create a new user object and we'll put this value in that object. Okay, so I will get new object. I will say user. I will say transformed user is equal to new user, and we will simply set this value. We already have a constructor, so we will use that constructor itself. So I will simply go here and I will say first name comma last name, right? And we will return this object instead of the original object. Okay, you can also sys out this if you want. I will simply say I will just add one sys out so that we can know this method is called or not, right? So I will say sys out and I will say converting and I will say user object, right? And I will say into this object, which is in our case transformed user, right? So transformed user plus this, something like this, right? And we also need to add one more thing. We need to add the toString method. Okay, so I will simply go here and create one toString method here as well. So I will say generate toString method with the parameters, right? And here is our method. So whenever this object is printed, it will print these values, first name, last name. Okay. Now next is let's create a very simple writer class, right? So we have a processor ready, we have model object ready. Now let's create a writer class. So I will create a writer, I will say new, and I will go and I will say user item writer. Okay, and I will put this in writer package, and of course we need to implement this with item writer. So I will say implements item writer. Okay, and item writer of what? It is of course of type user, right? So this is the class. Now let's override the write method. So I will say override method. Now this write method takes the chunk object as a input, and this chunk object contains all the user. So whenever processor process the object, all the objects are passed to the writer in a form of a chunk, right? So we will see this when we do the batch configuration. So basically it will get a list of objects. So writer always get the list of objects. Either you can pass a one object at a time or you can pass the 10 objects at a time. So that list is basically the chunk. Okay. So now we will simply retrieve the user object. So I will say chunk, and chunk already have a for each. Okay. So we will retrieve the user. So I will say simply retrieve here, and we will simply print. Okay. So we'll say sysout, and I will say here writer, and I will say user dot toString. Okay, so this is a very simple writer class. Okay, so till now what we have created very simple user object which contain first name and last name, which is very similar to our data file. And then we created the processor class which will be processing our user object. So basically this processor will convert our user first name and last name into uppercase, and then we will have a writer class which will be printing that object or adding that object to some output format, either in the file or database or on the console. Okay, now the next is we will put all these items together. So we will put reader, writer and processor into the format, create our batch or configure our batch. So let's see that in the next section. So now let's configure our batch, right? So I will say new class, and I will say batch configuration, and I will put this in a config package, config, right? And I will say finish. Now, as this is the configuration class, we need to annotate this with configuration. So I will say configuration. Okay, this is the annotation that we require. Now here we will simply create our beans, right? Now the first thing that we required here is we have the data file in place, but we don't have the logic to read this data file, right? So for that we required some reader. And as I said earlier, Spring Batch already provides a flat file item reader to read the data files. Okay, so let's create that bean. So I will say at the rate bean. I will just import this, and I will say public, and I will say flat file item reader, right? So this is the class we require, and this class will be converting the flat file into user object. So that's why that's a user, and I will say simply reader. Okay, and here we will return this object. So let's create the flat file item reader. How we can use it? We will use a builder class. So I will say return new flat file item reader builder. Okay, so we have flat file item reader builder class, right? And we will just make this generic, and I will say user. Okay, now it has a method, so we will give a name, and I will say user item reader, right? Then next is we also need to provide the file from where we are going to read the data. That is of course from a data.csv file. So let's add that. So I will say resource, and I will give new class path resource. Okay, and I will say data.csv since our file name is data.csv, right? Now, next is we need to tell that this file contains some delimitation character, right? So it contains the comma or a pipe or maybe some other character that you want, right? So we need to tell that it is delimited. So let's use this. And next is what kind of a delimited parameters it contains, right? So in our case, we are using first name and last name, right? So this is the first name and this is a last name. So it can also contain a multiple names. So that those names we need to provide over here. So we have method for that. So I will say names, and I will say first name, and I will say last name, right? And then we also need to tell that whenever this class read this data first and last, in which type of object it should create, right? So we will simply add that type. So I will say target type is of user dot Okay, so this configuration is sufficient for us, and now we will build our object. So this is how we have created a flat file item reader. Okay, so this is the first. Now next is we require the processor class, which we already created in our case. So let's create a bean for this. So I will say @bean, and I will say public. I will say user item processor, right? And I will say processor, and we will simply return the processor object here. So I will say return new user item processor. As simple as that, right? Now let's create our writer the same way what we have created a processor. So I will say @bean, right? And I will say public user item writer, right? And I will say writer, and let's return the writer class. So I will say return new user item writer. Okay, so now we have the reader, processor, and writer configured in the configuration. Now let's proceed ahead and prepare the configuration for our most important part of the Spring Batch, which is the job and the step. Let's see that in the next section. So let's create the step for this. So what will be the step in our case? So step will be defining what this batch is reading, what it is processing, and what it is writing. So those parts we need to configure in the step. Okay, so let's create a step. So I will say @bean, and I will say public. I will say step, and let's say step 1, or you can give any name, whatever name that you want. Okay, so I will say job repository. Okay, this repository we required because this is the main part of the Spring Batch. So repository. Okay, and then we will use a data source transaction manager. I will say data source transaction manager, and I will say transaction manager, right? And next is, of course, we required a reader, writer, and the processor. So let's pass that. So I will say flat file item reader, which is the user, and let's use the same, which is reader in our case. Then next is your user item processor. So I will say user item processor, and last is user item writer. So I will say writer. Okay, so we have all parameter in place. Now let's create the step for this, and here I will say let's use the builder class again. So I will say return new step builder, right? So step builder, and I will just pass the step name, which is step 1, right? And then we'll pass our repository. So I will say job repository. Okay, then next is the, as I mentioned earlier, so if you see the writer, there is a chunk object which is input to the write method. So we need to define this chunk. Okay, so whatever the data is processed by the processor, that data will be passed as a chunk. So for example, I want to provide 3 objects to the writer. So every time processor process 3 objects, it will pass it to the writer in the form of a chunk, and then next 3 object and next 3 object like that. Okay, so let's create the chunk. Let's define the chunk over there. So let's define the chunk over there, and simply I will say chunk. Okay, and we will pass the number, and we will also pass the transaction manager. So I will say transaction manager. Okay, we also need to provide the definition, what kind of a chunk we are providing. So it's a user and user. Okay, now next is let's pass the reader. So what will be the reader in our case, which is a reader, which is flat file item reader, right? And then of course the processor, very simple, we have a processor, and last is the writer. So we'll say writer, right? Now everything is ready. Let's build this object and I will say build. So our step is ready. Now this step will be provided to the job as an input. Now we will create our actual job. So I will simply say at the rate b and I will say public, which will be returning job, and I will say import user job. Okay, and we'll pass job repository. I will say job repository, and then we'll pass the step as well. So I will say step, and it will be step one. Okay, and let's build this object. We will use the same builder pattern here. So I will say return new job builder. We will pass the name, which is, let's say, import user job, same name as the method name, and we'll pass our job repository, right? And then let's start our step. So I will say step start what? Start step one. Okay, and let's build this. So here now our job definition is also ready. So here if you see how we have created is we defined the reader, we defined processor and writer, and then we created the step and then we created a job. Now this job is we something which will be running all of this. Okay. So now let's try to test this in the next section. Okay, now let's try to run this. So we simply see I will simply go here and say run as a Spring Boot app. So, so our program is run successfully. Now you can see in our processor, we added this. So converting this user object with name small in camel case, which is Jill and Doe, and it is converted to capital case, right? So if you see there are first three objects, then it is provided to writer. All these three objects and writer wrote that object. Then again, next remaining three objects or two objects, those will be used by the processor and then it will be provided to the writer, right? So here, if you see this chunk is basically how this chunk thing is working here, right? So every time, whatever the chunk that you have provided, those many kind of object will be processed by the processor and then it will be provided to the writer. So if you provide the 100 objects, it will process the 100 object and then it will provide it to the writer. If you want to provide a one by one, that will also be okay for this chunk. So you can simply pass one and then it will process one by one, right? So this is how it works. Now let's see how we can simply configure some kind of a completion listener for this. So now in our case, whenever job is completed, how our application knows that what is the status of that job, whether it is successful or a fail, or is there any kind of error happened, or what kind of the other parameter, or when that particular job was finished, right? So for that we have some kind of a listener already available, or we can create those listener at from our own, right? So let's create a job completion notification listener and I will say new class and I will say job completion notification listener. Okay, and I will just put this in listener package, listener package. Okay, I will click finish and let's create this. So this particular class will implement the job execution listener. So I will say implements job execution listener. Now, job execution listener has two methods. Okay, so we will override one of them. So I will simply go after the job. We required after the job. So what happened after the job? So this method will be executed once job is completed, either successful or failed whatever the result is. Okay, and you can simply use the job status or something. You can print all those operations, sanitization kind of operation in the after job method. Okay, so I will say sys out, and I will say, let's say, I will here say job finished. Let's say, right? So I will say job finished, finished, right? And you can simply print the status. So I will say with status, let's say we have a job execution, right, as a parameter which contains the status, right? So I will say get status. So it returns the batch status, which is kind of, the either kind of a enum, right, and which provide the details. Okay. So we have created a completion listener. Now let's configure this. So let's go to our batch configuration, right? And you can configure this simply at the job level, right? Because this is the job completion listener, which is related to job. So you need to configure this in your job builder, right? So here you can simply say, I will say listener, and I will pass a job completion listener. So for that, I will simply provide job completion listener as a parameter, and I will say listener. Okay, and let's pass this. Let's import this first. Yeah, so import is done, and let's save this. Now let's try to run this and let's see whether this line is printed or not. Okay, so I will simply go here and I will say run a Spring Batch service. Okay, there is some issue. Let's see what it is. We forgot to create the bin. So let's create the job listener bin as well. So I will simply go here and I will say bin, and I will say public, and I will say job completion listener. I will say listener, and we will simply return this. So I will say return new job completion listener. Okay. So let's save this and let's try to run this again. Yeah. So you can see. So once job is finished, we got the result of the job as well. So our after job method is executed with the status completed. Okay. So this is how we can create a very simple batch. So I hope you understand this. Now let's move to the next section. So I hope you understand the concept of a Spring Batch and how to create a very simple batch application using Spring Batch framework. So in this section, I mostly focus on the coding part and how to create this Spring Batch application using reader, processor, and a writer. Now, if you wanted to understand the Spring Batch fully, I'll be creating a dedicated separate series on a Spring Batch where I will be explaining all the details of the Spring Batch. Plus, we will also go through how to create a different kind of batches in a Spring using different functionalities. So stay tuned for it. So whatever the source code which I have explained in this tutorial is available on my GitHub repository, and you can find the link in the description section below. In case if you have any questions or queries, you can add those in comment section below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.